This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hi, I'm Blake Chastain, and this is Powers and Principalities. This show focuses on the systems and institutions that prop up white evangelical power and influence in America and the world. Season 1 is focused on white evangelicalism and Christian nationalism. This is episode 10. In this post-election episode, recorded on Monday, November 9th, I'm joined again by Professor Bradley Onishi of Straight White American Jesus to discuss the decisive electoral victory of President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. We discuss the historical importance of Vice President-elect Kamala Harris's election, the ramifications of 70 million people still casting their vote for President Trump, and where we go from here. I hope you enjoy this conversation as we try and make sense of a world where Biden and Harris clearly won, yet Trump and the overwhelming majority of GOP leadership refuse to acknowledge it, all while the pandemic rages uncontrolled outside our doors. As always, there are a few ways you can help support the show. You can let others know about it, rate and review it on Apple Podcasts, and support the show via a paid subscription to my newsletter, The Post-Evangelical Post. Other methods of support can also be found at evangelicalpodcast.com/support. All right, let's get right into it. Everybody, welcome back to Powers and Principalities. This is the first of what may be a series of post-election episodes of this particular season, and I want to welcome back to the show Professor Bradley Onishi from the Straight White American Jesus podcast. Brad, thanks for joining me again.
No, thanks for having me, Blake. Always fun to talk, especially in a week like this one.
Yeah, so we are recording this on Monday, November 9th. 2020. We just lived through election week, and there was a decisive electoral victory by President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. And where I want to start off our conversation is actually just to hear from your perspective what it means to see Kamala Harris in particular achieve this accomplishment.
Yeah, it's hard to understate how important it is. I mean, it's one of those situations where lost in the Trump meltdown about his loss, the refusal to accept the loss, the refusal to legitimate the election, all of that. In addition to the just days and days and days of uncertainty, all of us refreshing various websites, checking on Georgia and Arizona and Pennsylvania. So lost in just this myriad of controversies and stories and Rudy Giuliani showing up at a landscaping company and everything else is the fact that Kamala Harris, first woman VP, okay, that's big. It's huge. I mean, she's standing up there on the stage the other night, and just thinking about people like my nieces and watching little girls in the crowd and seeing them reflected in her is huge. And we're just as a country behind on this front. Other countries, of course, have had female prime ministers, presidents, and so on and so forth. So this is a big step for our country. She's also a mixed race person. Nate Silver, who got mixed reviews, I think, over the last couple of weeks from various folks, did have a nice, insightful thing that he said the other day, which was Democrats are 3-0 in the 21st century when they have a black person on the ticket. And Kamala Harris is a black person. Her dad is from Jamaica. And again, she's the first woman of color, right? That's a big thing. It's a massive thing. And so for, once again, Black Americans to have someone who represents, their story, their struggle, their heritage, their narrative, their experience in the White House, hard to understate that, right? She's also a South Asian woman. I'm an Asian American, and just to have someone who is from any part of Asia, Indian subcontinent, wherever it may be, it's just a big step forward. I'll be honest, Blake, it's easy, I think, for people to forget about Asian Americans as a minority in the sense that they're often dubbed the model minority. They're often seen as the quiet Americans, the unassuming neighbors across the street. And what we've seen over the course of the pandemic is that Asian Americans are your model minority as long as you want them to be. And then when you perceive them to be a threat, they're a threat. And you'll unleash every vitriolic, xenophobic attack you can think of on them when you need to and when you want to. And so we've seen that. We've seen the president use various slurs for the virus and tracing it to China. We've seen attacks on Asian Americans go through the roof. These things are not lost on the very diverse and very heterogeneous Asian American community. And so to have Kamala Harris there, the daughter of an Indian immigrant, somebody who came to the country when she was 19, somebody who settled in Oakland, one of the most diverse and radical cities that we have in the country. All of that is huge. Her husband is Jewish. SNL was making fun of this the other night, but together they tick a lot of boxes. Last thing I'll say here, and then I'll turn it back over to you, is just there's kind of two things at play here. I think in the ways I just outlined, so many folks will be able to find themselves represented in Kamala Harris, and even in Doug Emhoff, her husband, who's as a Jewish person, being in the White whatever he is, second gentleman, I don't know what he's supposed to be called,
right?
But
the first second gentleman.
The first second gentleman is a Jewish gentleman, and that's also a big deal. Okay. So all that to say, I think many people are going to be able to locate themselves in Kamala Harris and in Doug Emhoff in ways that they couldn't before. In another way, and this is not at all meant to be controversial. I'm not truly. It's not meant to be a hot take. I'm not trying to drive clicks. As somebody who's a biracial person, I know how this works in the sense that sometimes when people can't reduce you to one thing, they don't know what to do, and then they sort of just either ignore it or leave it alone or mischaracterize it, right? So one of the things I'm curious to watch is to see how the media and the American public reckons with just the stunning diversity in Kamala Harris and in her marriage. Like we have, a black American, and a South Asian American, a Jewish American. We have the Jewish faith. We have, Black Baptist heritage. We have, Hindu heritage. There's all sorts of things at play here. And I really hope that we can bring to the fore all of those components and all of those aspects of Kamala Harris, rather than sort of just either getting bored and not doing any of it, or emphasizing one to the detriment of the many. Real quick, I'll just say you can see that if Harris can find a signature issue and a signature sort of public-facing character as she serves as vice president, you can see a very clear path forward to her as a presidential candidate. I mean, you can just see how she would break so many glass ceilings at once as a president. And if she can sort of earn the American public's trust in that role, you can just see, whether it's 24 or 28, it's just not hard to imagine this going in that direction. So anyway, those are some initial thoughts, and we'll just have to see how it all plays out.
Yeah, that's all very well said, and I think you're absolutely right that the American populace as well as the American media, they are both reductive, and they seek to tell the simplest story. That doesn't work in this sort of context, and it'll be interesting to see the ways in which we as a people, and as well as people that generate media, whether that's podcasts like this or established media, adapt to that sort of reality and the successes and very much more likely failures to accomplish that task. I'm curious what your take is really in what we've started to learn about how faith played a role in this particular election. a focus for both of us is white evangelicalism, and white evangelicals seemed to vote the same as they did in 2016 by and large. We're still getting data. One piece of data that's surfaced within NPR, and a recent NPR report, was between 76 and 81% of white evangelicals continued their support for President Trump during the 2020 election. What other sort of patterns are you seeing begin to emerge? We can start with white evangelicalism, but then we can also branch out and see and discuss things like the religious left or other types of religious voters that were motivated to either support Trump or defect, as it were, or vote. And so if they had voted for Trump in 2016 or vocally supported Biden in this 2020 campaign.
Sure. So if we start with white evangelicals, I think he may have gotten 81%. It looks like it may be more in the high 70s, right? And so I think this is both a big deal and not a big deal. It's a big deal because Trump needed every last one of those white evangelical votes,
right,
to win. And in places like Michigan, in places like Georgia, they were important. And for him to drop even a couple percentage points, we knew was actually going to affect things. So from an electoral perspective, I actually do think it's somewhat significant, especially when you add in the fact that from 4 years ago, the overall percentage of white evangelicals in the country has gone down. So there's fewer of them. And then you peel off a couple of percent. Electorally, that's a problem for Trump. He was hoping for 82, 85, something like that. Okay. So symbolically, we're still in a place where 77, 78% of white evangelicals voted for this man, even after 4 years of everything we saw, separating children at the border, forced hysterectomies, a Muslim ban, so on and so forth, right? So on that front, not a big deal. I mean, this is not a huge sea change. A couple of other things, I'm working off some data from Ryan Burge, who's a sociologist of religion, and it looks as if there were some significance the wrong word, but some notable and not to be overlooked drops among white Catholics. And I think we expected this, some of us did at least, that Biden's a Catholic, Biden's sort of running on this platform of decency and honesty and just sort of being a boy from Scranton was going to appeal to some white Catholics in Erie County or in Allegheny County, near Pittsburgh or, wherever it may be. I think we saw that. Okay. Now, I just want to say, however, one thing though, talking about just white Christian voters in general, is they still voted for Trump in big numbers. I mean, even if you take the mainline white Christian goes from according to Burge, 55% to 51%. It's really easy to think of mainline white Christians as like social justice warriors. It's just a really bad characterization. I'm sorry. We've got over half white mainliners voting for Trump. I mean, we need to get rid of the notion in our mind that if you're a white mainline Christian, that you are somehow what we would call progressive. It's just not true. And so one of the takeaways, Blake, I have more to say here, but I'll throw it back to you after this, is just white Christians are still voting for Trump in either majorities or close to majorities. And, we can talk about a lot of different stories from this election, but whiteness was here, and whiteness came out to the polls, and it came out to the polls no matter if you were Catholic or evangelical or mainline. I just think that's something we can't let go of too quickly here.
Right. I fully agree. Just even sort of emotionally responding to the results beginning on Tuesday was seeing how close it seemed at first. And a lot of that came down to all of that election day voting and people continuing their patterns of voting for their party of preference, regardless of all evidence to everything that we know that the Trump administration has done. And I fully agree that whiteness and the power of that sort of white supremacy and the unexamined whiteness that a lot of people operate within played a major factor. And that's why my initial reaction after Tuesday was that of being both hopeful and heartbroken. I will admit that I was more blindsided than I should have been in 2016 to the white evangelical support for Trump. I had sort of hoped for better. I didn't expect any better this time, but it was still a disappointment. And I think that's just something that you just have to acknowledge as being someone that comes from a white evangelical perspective, something that you have to grieve and acknowledge and not put that burden on anyone else. The burden of responsibility is to talk to our relatives and things like that still maintain these positions and continue breaking that whiteness down. So I'm getting a little far afield now, but those were sort of my initial reactions. I fully agree with that. If you have any other comments about that, feel free to jump in now or bring or move us to another topic relative to what we're seeing from this election.
Well, a couple. So if we think about the religious left, I think one of the things that happens on the religious left, especially the Christian religious left, is so the religious left includes, I don't want to be, Christian exclusive here, right? Religious left includes many Jewish folks, many Muslims, many Hindus, many people in that under that category. But if we talk about the religious Christian left, okay, one of the issues that comes up that I think about a lot is diffusion. That the religious left is often diffuse, meaning that when they go to the polls, when they explain the issues that matter to them, when they talk about who they're voting for and why, the religious aspect is often diffused into all the other things for good reason, okay? Racial justice, income inequality, poverty, healthcare, right? Representation, okay? All of these things. So we can sometimes get masked. We sometimes get a religious left that is masked, whether intentionally or not. So there's a way, Blake, that we could write the story of the 2020 election as the religious left the story of the religious left is a story of people of color. And the people of color who turned out for Biden is a story of the religious left. So let me give you some examples. Shared these on Friday on our weekly roundup. Stacey Abrams, star of the show here, that I'm sure everyone has heard and talked about and knows what happened there in Georgia. Raised by two Methodist ministers, says in interviews that my faith is what infuses my politics. Okay, if that was Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio, we'd all recognize her as a Christian candidate, Christian politician, Christian leader. But that's not what leads the story when you think of Stacey Abrams. It's not a Christian candidate. It's a black woman for good reason. We don't have any, we don't have enough. We have some, but we don't have enough black women, right, represented in this country. I mean, that goes without saying. So, of course, we're talking about Stacey Abrams as a black woman, but she's also a Christian. She's also part of the religious left. Cori Bush is going to represent Missouri in Congress. Cori Bush is a black woman. Cori Bush is a pastor. Okay. We don't talk about that. We have two Senate runoffs. One in Georgia. One of the candidates there is Raphael Warnock, who took over the pulpit of one Martin Luther King Jr. at Ebenezer Baptist in Georgia. Right? He went to Morehouse College. He got a PhD. Lived in public housing as a kid. Had 11 brothers and sisters, and became a minister. That's all the religious left. All of it. Right.
Right.
I just did an interview, and I'm going to post it tomorrow with Dr. Robert Chow Romero, who's a pastor and a professor of Chicano studies at UCLA. And he talks all about the brown church. And when I think of what he shared with me in our interview, I think about Arizona and the brown church turning out. I think about the religious left in that way too. And so all of that to say, there's a way that you could write the feature story at New York Magazine or the New Yorker or wherever you wanted to write it about the religious left it delivers for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, because all of these stories we're hearing out of Georgia and other places. I don't want to leave out places like Detroit, places like Philly, right? We know that the folks who are organizing there, many of them are people of faith. Many of them are doing so within the community. Within the Christian community, the faith community. So anyway, those are just some thoughts I think can get lost as we sort of try to dissect what happened in these various places and who showed up for Biden and how it happened.
Right. Those points can often get lost because we're working against 40 years of conditioning about the religious right. Media conditioning, lots of different types of conditioning of just an expectation that a religious candidate looks like a straight white guy who's Protestant and evangelical. That's why we see these instances of charismatic churches praying towards voting, where poll workers are counting votes. And Michelle Bachmann today praying a prayer. Kenneth Copeland laughing that the media called the election. All of these different things, but beneath all that are these things that multiple biases that we have to rid ourselves of, especially with white dominant places and white dominant media, is the active work of, as you said, communities led by Black members of the faith and members of politics, as well as other non-white groups. I know this is a terrible segue. I'm an associative thinker, and one of the things that became talked about a lot just during the period when a lot of anchors needed to fill time because these poll workers were still counting votes was, in particular, the Latino community and how some of them supported Trump more than expected supported Trump. And one of the things that came up that a lot of Latinx commentators were saying is that our community is not a singular community. It's not a monolith. That seems to be another trend that we're touching on here is things are more diffuse, to use your terminology, and more complicated, and not homogenous like honestly the Republican evangelical alternative is.
Yeah. No, that I think that's exactly right. So one of the things that I focus on a lot in these cases is Viet Thanh Nguyen, the writer, Vietnamese American, always talks about narrative lack and narrative saturation. So when your story is represented in a way that is either sufficient or saturating, we are going to attend to all the differences in your group because we see you so much. We see you so much that we're like, well, even though you're all white dudes with white hair or yellow hair, white dudes with white hair, and you're between 5'8" and 6'2", we're going to attend to every difference among you because we see you so much, your stories, your identities, right? So when it comes to white voters, we have the white rural voter, we have the white rural Midwestern voter, we have the white, Southern voter, we have all kinds of different ways that we might talk about that. So then you get to what surprised some people on Tuesday night, which was Florida goes very quickly to Trump, and there's a lot more support among the Latino community in Miami-Dade County, especially in other places in Florida. I am not an expert on Florida. I'm not an expert on Cuban immigration. I'm not not going to speak here as somebody who is a sort of scholarly voice on this. But what I do agree with wholeheartedly, Blake, is there is no uniformity. So when you use a category like Latino, it's trying to capture a stunning set of differences under one rubric and to explain to you what everyone in that category is thinking, doing, voting in ways that are just cannot never avoid being reductive. They are always going to be reductive. And so when you take the person who's from Florida, grows up in Miami, a very urban sort of dense city place, their heritage is Cuban, and then you say, well, they're in the same category as the person who grew up in Arizona or New Mexico or California, and they are Mexican migrants or they are refugees from a South American country that was marked by violence or by other things. There's just no way that you can attend to the nuance there when you're just talking about Latino voters. Okay, that's just really not going to help. And so what I would say is I look forward to the deep dive, right? I'm happy to read the 5,000 words on what happened in Miami-Dade County. I want to read that. I want to know how faith played into that. I want to know why so many folks went for Trump there. But I also want to read the 5,000 words again about the Brown Church showing out for Harris and Biden in Arizona, or the indigenous communities showing out for Biden and Harris in Arizona. I want to read those too, and I want those to be something that we attend to and pay attention to. I think all of that's really, really important. And so, anyway, sorry for a long answer there, but I just really can't hammer that point home enough that when you use, even as an Asian American, when you say Asian American and you start trying to talk about the experiences of someone from Bangladesh, a Vietnamese refugee, a 4th century Japanese American whose family's from Hawaii, you just, it gets to the point where the differences are starting to outweigh the similarities, and it's really hard. Those kinds of generalizations just end up being very unhelpful.
Right. There's so much to that, just of the relative, the general sort of laziness of him to try to find the common denominator while also ignoring distinct and important differences and the unique aspects of life. And I mean, that's obviously tied directly into whiteness and the history of so many negative shadows of American history and culture that, for the most part, we being primarily white audiences and white people tend to ignore or try not to think about. This is an issue that we still struggle with. To me, that might be the thing that we really come away from this election remembering, is the Biden coalition was truly more of a coalition of a lot of people that had the Biden-Harris coalition, of a lot of different groups that had to unite in order to stand against a very homogenous ticket in Trump and Pence and what the current administration represents. I and so many other people had hoped to see a stronger repudiation of this administration, but at least we know even more clearly than ever what we're working against.
Yeah, I agree. I think, one of the things I said the other day was just, I think Tuesday felt bad because intellectually we'd all accepted that it was going to be a long road. It was going to take 4 or 5 days or a week or more.
Mm-hmm.
But we wanted that visceral condemnation on Tuesday. We wanted to see Texas flip. We wanted Florida to go blue. We wanted, to see the Ohio's flip and just think, okay, here we go. We got Ohio, we got Texas, we got Florida, and then we got the blue wall, and then boom, all of a sudden it's a 400 and something to 100 something electoral college, and take that, Trump, and here we are, America, we're proud, right? And we didn't get it, Blake, and we know it. We got 70 million people voting for Donald Trump after 4 years of what we saw.
Right.
Your show, what you're doing here, what I do on my show, in many ways, unfortunately, there's no shelf life because we just had 70 million people show out for white supremacy, and that's just where we are. And even if and when we get to a Biden inauguration and presidency, I really feel like we're in a situation that is comparable to right after the Civil War and Reconstruction, where white Southern Christians many of them have still not accepted that they lost the Civil War. So if you think they're going to accept that Donald Trump lost in a month or two, buckle up. That's all I have to say.
That's a very good segue to where I want to go next and talk through with you, which is really Saturday was a jubilant day for people that wanted to see Biden and Harris victorious. And we saw that. And we saw the pictures. We may have even participated in some of the celebrations throughout the world. I was lucky enough to be in this neighborhood of Chicago on Saturday that's just known. I was there in 2016. One of the good things that happened in 2016 was the Cubs won the World Series, and I drove through this neighborhood after the Cubs won the World Series, and there was honking and celebration, and there was even more of that on Saturday, like in the middle of the day. And that was all just coincidence. But then you saw this celebration throughout the country, and just taking a breath and feeling that and acknowledging that. And then Sunday rolls around and Trump hasn't conceded. We're talking on Monday, and over the weekend, Lindsey Graham is on TV trying to sow disinformation, challenge the results of the election, court evangelicals, to use John Fee's term, are pushing misinformation campaign of voter fraud, and people like Eric Metaxas are participating in that. And even today, Mitch McConnell refused to acknowledge in his remarks on the Senate floor that Joe Biden won the presidency. And it's really disconcerting given the major divide we have within our information ecosystems here in this country, and what that means to how we're able to move forward. Because the Biden campaign wants to move forward, they're trying to push this narrative of unity, and how can you unite with someone that won't even acknowledge that you won a fair game?
Yep. Well, okay, so Blake, just to do real quick, you and I both know that if you want Jesus to forgive you, you have to confess and you have to repent. We know that. We know that. And
that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, and a lot of folks listening know that. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So when you want to I know this is a tangent, but real quick, if you want to say, hey, let's forgive and forget. Okay. Not even Jesus forgives and forgets until you confess and change your ways. So, if Jesus wouldn't do it, how do you expect us to think that that's how this works? It doesn't. I once had a friend after a long, prolonged, sort of disagreement and conflict that threatened to end our friendship say, after months of not speaking to me, you know what? Let's just have this be water under the bridge and let's just move forward. And my response to that friend was, you can't have water under a bridge without a bridge. That's not possible. And so if people who support a fascist, people who support somebody who put a Muslim ban in effect, separated kids at the border, so on and so forth, just want to say, well, that's over now. Okay, let's just go back to like kumbaya. That's not how it works. Anyway, just a short side note there.
No, that's not a side note. That's a main primary note.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, that's absolutely true. People just want to move on. Even people, you would expect this from Republican leadership, but Mitt Romney in a Bloomberg article said that this election was a confirmation of conservative principles, but a referendum on a person, which is mind-bogglingly convoluted to say that your side lost by millions of votes. And it's not that. It's just clearly not.
Yeah, I agree. I want to go to what you said there about like Metaxas and McConnell basically saying the same thing, right? So what we have here, Blake, is we have Republican leadership, McConnell, Lindsey Graham, and others saying, we don't recognize Joe Biden as the president-elect. It's crazily dangerous. We have the two Republicans who are in the runoff for Senate calling for the resignation of the Republican AG in Georgia because of whatever they think that Attorney General did to, quote unquote, mishandle the election. Okay. What we also have, though, as you mentioned, is people like Eric Metaxas and the court evangelicals basically either word for word agreeing with them or leading the charge in resisting the election results. And here's just one thing I want to point out about that is it has not always been this way. That what we see right now is the Venn diagram of white evangelical and Christian nationalist overlapping with Republican. There's no Venn diagram. It's just a circle, right? The two have become they've enveloped into one circle. They've been subsumed into each other. Okay. Mm-hmm. It has not been that way forever. Like you could, even in the 60s and 70s and 80s, it did not work that way. There was a difference. There was a separation. Okay. And what we've seen is just this full on marriage of the white evangelicalism to the GOP. And they just keep pushing each other to further extremes. Right. Like if you ask me, why is McConnell doing that, Blake, I really think it's because he thinks the only way to get the base out in Georgia to win the Senate is by Trumpism. So he's like, all right, if I concede that Biden won on the Senate floor right now, we probably don't get what we need to come out on January 5. to elect these two senators. So you know what? I'm willing to put our democracy on unsure footing. I'm willing to weaken our democratic institutions because I think from a messaging standpoint, if we don't concede, then a lot of angry people will go to the polls in Georgia on January 5 to put in our two Republican senators. Whereas if I take a sort of normal and honorable approach to electoral politics and democracy, I may not get the kind of energy I need from our base in Georgia to win those elections. So let's do it. I'm going to just throw everything into question, and Trump may or may not be president January 20th. But and I'm speaking to McConnell, not as me. But you know what? I don't care. I'm going to keep with the Trumpism. The Trumpism staying. The tactics, the disinformation, the inability to provide evidence for your claims when asked, all of that's going to stay, even if and when Trump is gone. And to me, that's the thing we cannot forget. Like, Saturday was so jubilant and it was so amazing. But anyone, who, excuse me, who's had a cancer diagnosis knows that you win one battle and you got to be vigilant in the next moment, right? And I'm not saying this to be blasé in any way about cancer. What I'm saying is, if you take that metaphor and apply it to Trump and Trumpism, Trump is the malignant narcissist that we have to jettison from our public sphere. That is completely true. But then you always have to be on the lookout, right, for more cancerous cells. And I think McConnell, I think Graham, I think Georgia Republicans are showing us how that's just going to be a constant vigil for the next however many years. And you think I'm crazy? Well, look at Italy. Berlusconi came back how many times? Look at Israel. Netanyahu came back how many times? How many times? Like, do you remember learning about Napoleon when you were like in 8th grade? And you're like, holy moly, how many times did Napoleon? Here's my point. These guys just don't go away. They're going to hang around as long as they can and haunt your democracy. So that's where we are now, if you ask me.
I would be very hard pressed to disagree with you because of the actions of the Senate leadership and others. At last count earlier today, there were only 3 GOP senators that acknowledged the results of the election. And it's just astonishing. So today I listened to a podcast that Kirk Cameron and Eric Metaxas recorded the day after the 2016 election. And there was no mention about waiting for the states to ratify the election. There was no mention of voter fraud, which is just incredible that they've found another way in which to weaponize the pandemic and use the reality of people voting by mail in order to not expose themselves to a deadly pandemic, that they're using that to sow fear, uncertainty, and doubt about the results of the election, and that they've been priming their audience for decades to just be skeptical without. And they've also found a way to divorce skepticism from evidence in a way that is exceedingly troublesome. And they all of it, as you said, Christian nationalism or republicanism, white evangelicalism, it's a circle. And so one aspect of one affects them all. It's literally the QAnon reference. It's literally where we go one, we go all. That's literally what's happening right now in the Republican Party and in white evangelicalism. And it is absolutely wild. I don't have any way to tie up what I'm saying right now just because it's hard to even fathom that this is the Republican Party that currently has control of our government and refuses to bend the knee in any way whatsoever to the will of the people, which they are supposed to be serving.
Yeah. I have just 2 quick responses that I because I agree with everything you said. And I think 2 things. One, Blake, we grew up in an evangelicalism that, especially prior to George W. Bush, would just repeat this line all over, right? That it's not about earthly power, that earthly power is not our goal. that yes, we want to influence the world in politics, yes. But in my church and in my culture, I heard a lot about how, look, it doesn't matter whether or not there's complete control of the U.S. government by Christians or whoever, that God's work is going to continue no matter what. Okay. So don't get me wrong. Was there like incredible fights to get Ronald Reagan elected and to combat Bill Clinton, and get him out of office when the Monica Lewinsky stuff happened? Sure. Okay. But there was not a like full on do or die investment in political power like there is now. I mean, I've checked in on people on Facebook from those days and my evangelical circles. And for them, this election is it's do or die. Like if Trump really does in their mind lose, and he has lost, don't get me wrong, I know that, but in their mind, if he really does lose, they're just not sure what's going to happen. They think it's just like that just literally cannot be true because God does not want that. And that segues into a different thought, which is, okay, well, how about you, Brad? Why don't you go back to how you reacted when Trump won in 2016? Why did you get to be all up in arms and you won't accept that they are up in arms in this similar way? And here's my response. We had evidence in 2016 that there was interference in our election. So you say, hey, why were you dismayed? Part of it was because I knew what was coming in Trump. I knew what was coming in his approach to governing. I also had evidence about Russian interference. And since then, every intelligence agency in this country has verified that the Russians did interfere in our election, right? So if we go down every avenue on the interference in the election category, we see that there's deep concern there about, okay, was there access to voting machines? How did disinformation sweep in? What happened with Jim Comey and the FBI stuff? Blah, 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 right? There's actual documented evidential reasons to have that like existential concern for our democracy. And then you turn around and you say to Rudy Giuliani or your high school bro on Facebook or a state legislator in Arkansas, well, why are you so dismayed by what happened here? And they say, well, I've heard about irregularities. Well, I've heard about a poll worker who did this, this, and this. Okay, I just want the evidence. Can you show me the evidence? Well, I heard this from a friend, and I think we all know mail-in voting, and how did all this stuff happen? No, I just want evidence. Can you give me the evidence? No. And then at this point, you're just typing the the hand clap emoji, like evidence, E, hand clap B. Like, just give me the evidence, and we'll talk. Guess what? No Giuliani, no Loeffler, no Perdue, no McConnell, no Graham. Nobody has any evidence. And that's why even Fox News today cut away from Kayleigh McEnany when she was peddling these conspiracies, because Neil Cavuto was just like, we have no evidence. We can't allow her to say this. I'm sorry. Anyway, to me, Blake, those are the two things that stick out in response to your comments.
Right. Speaking in regards to the Cavuto cutting away, I saw that just prior to us starting to record as well. And what I thought really was that I am somewhat worried just because within conservative media, I mean, I grew up in a family that watched a lot of conservative media, a lot of Rush Limbaugh, things like that. The evolution of conservative media, cooler heads, more reasonable heads don't really prevail there. And that's what worries me, is that is the trend towards further radicalization, towards further belief, just unquestionable faith in their particular party. And I can't think of another word to describe it than that, than just straight up blind faith. That to deny the evidence of your eyes and everything else and believe that your political enemy is so vile that they could do anything. And that's my worry at this point, is that McConnell and others are pushing this, and I mean, they're happy because they're on their side. I'm just not sure where this leads, and it's sort of a difficult place to be, to know that is the reality of those media ecosystems and those communities, to think so little of their political opponents that they believe they're enemies. And that's why Biden, I think, has tried to lean on this sense of unity. And it's something that we need in order to overcome the biological threat of this pandemic and the democratic threat of Christian nationalism. But I just circle back to this concern over people not being willing participants in either. And I'm not sure what the path forward is for us.
I'm not either. It's interesting. I think I've seen you posting on Twitter about how your next sort of direction for this show is to examine media. Mm-hmm. And I think that's incredibly poignant, because one of the things we really need to understand more clearly is how these media networks just are ubiquitous. If you didn't grow up in a house like that, like you talked about Rush Limbaugh and all the other various parts of that ecosystem, Blake, if you didn't grow up in that, it's hard to understand how it surrounds you, how it just,
right.
It filters in every space that you're in. It's the air you breathe. And to get outside of that and to talk about getting outside of it is to have everyone in your family and community look at you as if you've lost your mind, right? That you would, you know, when I was a teenager and you if you mentioned CNN, the first thing someone said to you was, well, if you want to watch the Communist News Network, go ahead. But I'm not gonna do that, right? And you think about that now, and CNN is so middle of the road and so just blah in terms of its leanings that that's the kind of environment we have. So you're going to go toward media, and I think what I've decided over the last day or two is I'm going to do a deep dive into Reconstruction and the period after the Civil War, just to try to show folks historically a period when we were this divided as a country, and what happened when we left those perpetrators of divisiveness and violence off the hook. Because I feel like that's going to be the temptation to these very banal calls for unity that have no effect except to allow those who have waged war on democracy to continue to roam free. So anyway, I feel like that's, I'm excited to see what you do with media, and I'm really excited for myself to jump into some episodes on Reconstruction and religion and lost cause theology, just to sort of show folks how we have done this before. And maybe that will help us think about ways to move forward. So anyway, both those seem important to me.
Yeah. I mean, that line about hope and history rhyming.
Yeah.
I guess the inverse is true too, as well. And shitty things in history rhyme too. And that'll be an incredibly valuable and really insightful thing to explore, that period of history and how people tried to rush towards reconciliation. And so many people, so many Black commentators, so many other, I never say this out loud, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, are making comments, are bringing that to the fore, is that reconciliation without justice is not real. So
it's amoral. It's not moral.
Yeah. For that to be a focus in the coming weeks and months and the ensuing Biden-Harris administration, I hope will not be lost as they try to move forward. And just as Obama inherited a terrible economic mess from a Republican president, Biden is inheriting a terrible biological, life-threatening mess from Trump. And so that will absolutely skew his presidency. Despite all of these things, despite all of these concerns, we did have a moment of jubilation on Saturday. What are you looking forward to, just in a sort of clear-eyed way, about the potential future here and for our country and for the ways in which we can provide context for people about the things that we face?
I know we've all dealt with this in big and small ways, right? But you ever have a time when you feel like, life is going along okay? I'm whatever it is, family, home life, work, friends, hobbies, whatever it is about your life, you're like, that's pretty good. And then maybe something happens, you get sick, and let's just call it a small sickness. Okay. Let's say you have the stomach flu for 5 days, Blake, and you're just at home, and we all know the stomach flu is miserable. If you eat things don't go well, and so you don't eat, and you lose 10 pounds, and you're just in bed, and it's just awful, right? And you just all you wish for when you're in that kind of sickness, not even talking about life-threatening, tragic disease sort of sicknesses, even just that terrible stomach flu, can't keep any food down, stuck in bed for 72 hours straight, pounding headache, fever kind of sickness. You know what you long for? You just long for getting back to square one, right? It's not even like you're thinking, it's not even like you have this sense of like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to improve every aspect of my life. I'm going to eat better, go to the gym, be a better spouse, finally go to therapy, maybe read those books I've been putting off, and call my parents more. Like, you're not even thinking about being your optimal self at that point. You're just thinking, I just wish things would go back to normal. And once they're back to normal, I'll be able then to sort of stop, breathe, and then move forward. That's, to me, what Saturday was. It was this relief that we now will rejoin the World Health Organization. We'll be part of the Paris Agreement, that we'll have normal relations with our allies in, Western Europe and East Asia and other parts of the country or the world. To me, Blake, I'll just say, like, I said this on, I think last time I was on your show, when Obama was elected, it felt like we were going from square one to like an unimagined future of who knew we could progress to this level. And I cried my eyes out that night. On Saturday, I cried all day. And it was mainly just from happiness, seeing people dancing, seeing different videos of folks celebrating, champagne bottles, everything else. But it was like after you're sick and you go back to normal life, and it just feels so good. You wake up on that Monday and you actually go to work, you actually eat your lunch and talk to your friends and come home and you feel fine. You ever had that feeling after being sick? It's just like, you're like so thankful that life is just normal again. That's where we are now. So if you want me to be clear-eyed, I can already feel my blood pressure boiling about who Biden might pick for his cabinet. And I'm already like worried that the Democrats are sidelining people like AOC and the progressives. And I don't want to hear about John Kasich. Okay. I just don't. I don't want to hear about. So I can already hear and feel myself getting stressed and anxious about those things. But in a clear-eyed way, I'm just glad that we're back to square one. Yes, Paris Agreement, World Health Organization. Biden just released the people who are going to help him advise for COVID. Oh, look, no family members, no quack doctors, no My Pillow guy. Oh, look at this. It's a Tulga Wanda and other PhDs and doctors and world-renowned physicians. Sounds great. That's what you would expect, right? And so that's what I'm looking forward to more than anything.
Yeah, that's a great note to end on, I think, because getting back to normal and being able to address the things that need to be addressed is just going to be so valuable and so meaningful. And I think a lot of people feel as if we barely had a government, and it's hard to deny that reality. So, well, Brad, thank you so much for joining me and just trying to put some context to what we've seen and really just try to, I don't know, like, yes, take that breath, but also realize how much work is ahead. Like, so many things that we have to hold at once. And maybe that's just the postmodern or post-post or post-post-postmodern or whatever, wherever we are. Reality is that we just have to accept that this is a good thing, and there's also a whole bunch of bad things and lots more work to do. And I'm glad that there are people like you who are giving context to these things and willing to talk to me about this stuff and frame it in a way that I hope is helpful for people. So thank you so much for joining me today. Where can people find you online, and where can they find your podcast and anything else you're up to?
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Blake. It's always great to talk. And I just, it's ditto for you in terms of your work and everything you're doing. And so thankful for that. And I'm on Twitter at Bradley Onishi. My podcast is Straight White American Jesus. That's at Straight White JC on Twitter. We have if you want to know about how the Venn diagram became a circle in terms of the religious right and the GOP, we have a whole series called The Orange Wave, and it's 10 parts. Starts in basically 1960, and it covers everything from masculinity to white supremacy, electoral politics, homeschooling, everything you can think of. So check that out at straightwhiteamericanjesus.com. And that's about it. So thanks again, Blake, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Okay, that'll do it for this week. I'll have at least one more episode to round out this season, but recording times have had to be shuffled around some, so don't be surprised if there's a 1 week delay or so. As always, this episode was produced by Jake Lewis. Thank you very much, Jake. The theme music is by Dave Lefevre and Jake Lewis. If you enjoyed this conversation, please rate and review Powers and Principalities on Apple Podcasts and let others know about the show. All right, talk to you soon.